In 1905, a lawyer named Armanus F. Knotts began quietly buying land in northwest Indiana. He worked for the largest corporation in the world, United States Steel, and his instructions were simple. Purchase 9,000 acres of swamp, sand dune, and scrub oak along the southern shore of Lake Michigan without letting anyone know who was behind it. If the sellers figured out that the buyer was a company capitalized at $1.4 billion, prices would triple overnight. So Knotts moved parcel by parcel, farmer by farmer, across Calumet Township, assembling a vast stretch of nothing 30 miles southeast of Chicago. When he was finished, U.S. Steel had spent $7.2 million on land that 2 years earlier nobody had wanted. What happened next was one of the most extraordinary acts of urban creation in American history. On April 18, 1906, Knotts and his brother Thomas stood at a spot where two future streets would cross, Fifth Avenue and Broadway, and drove the first stake into the sand. There was no town. There were no streets. There were sand dunes 40 feet high, dense marsh grass, and the grand Calumet River winding lazily through the wetlands. Within 2 years, U.S. Steel would spend $42 million turning this emptiness into the largest integrated steel mill on earth and a company town to house the men who ran it. They leveled the dunes. They drained the swamps. They moved the river 1,000 feet south. They built 2 parallel piers reaching half a mile into Lake Michigan to create a deep-water harbor at a cost of $2.5 million for the harbor alone. And they named the whole thing after their chairman, Judge Elbert H. Gary, a former DuPage County judge from Illinois who had never set foot on the site. Broadway, remember that name. It would become the spine of everything that followed. The Gary Land Company, a U.S. Steel subsidiary, platted the town in a neat grid south of the mill. Broadway ran north to south, and the numbered avenues ran east to west. The land company didn't just draw lines on a map. It paved the streets, poured the sidewalks, installed the sewers, built the waterworks, constructed gas and electric plants, and donated lots for schools, churches, and a hospital. The first subdivision covered 800 acres divided into 4,000 lots, and the company built 506 permanent houses between 1906 and 1909. These went mostly to executives and skilled foremen, men who could afford the rents. The unskilled workers, the ones who actually poured the steel, had to find their own way. On July 23, 1908, the ore boat Elbert H. Gary steamed into the new harbor carrying its first load of iron ore from Minnesota. The town erupted, cannons fired, tug whistles screamed, a parade marched down Broadway, which at that point was barely 2 years old. By December, the first of 12 blast furnaces was producing iron. By February 1909, the open hearths were tapping steel, and the rail mill was turning out its first finished product. By the end of that year, 6,800 workers had produced 570,000 tons of steel. The Magic City, that's what the boosters called it, was open for business. And magic it really did seem to be. In 1906, the site had been empty dunes. By 1910, Gary had 16,802 residents. By 1920, it had 55,378. That's growth of more than 12% per year for a decade, which is the kind of number that makes real estate speculators lose sleep from excitement. The workers came from everywhere. By 1910, nearly half the population had been born outside the United States. Serbs, Croats, Poles, Slovaks, Hungarians, Greeks, Romanians, Italians, and Mexicans. Another 30% were native-born Americans with at least one immigrant parent. 52 nationalities made their home in Gary by 1920. It was a global village held together by molten steel. But Gary was really 2 cities from the very beginning. North of the Wabash Railroad tracks, the Gary Land Company maintained order. The streets were paved and clean. The houses were solid. There were building codes and liquor restrictions. This was the company's showcase, the model town they showed visitors and put in photographs. South of the tracks was another world entirely, the Patch. Here, the unskilled laborers built shanties, rented cots in overcrowded boarding houses, and spent their wages in saloons that never closed. The company had spent the best engineering in the world on the steel mill. A couple of miles south, The workers who fed those furnaces lived in chaos. Into this volatile mix came a school superintendent who would briefly make Gary famous for something other than steel. William Wirt arrived in 1907, the same year the town was incorporated, and immediately began building something no one expected from a steel town, the most progressive school system in America. Wirt, a farm boy from eastern Indiana who had studied under John Dewey at the University of Chicago, believed that schools should do more than teach reading and arithmetic. His idea was the work-study-play system, also called the platoon plan. Students were divided into two groups. While one group studied academics, the other rotated through workshops, gymnasiums, swimming pools, auditoriums, and gardens. Then they switched. Every classroom stayed in use all day. Every child spent half the day learning to build things, cook things, grow things, and perform things. The schools had shops where boys learned metalwork, cabinetry, and printing. They had kitchens where girls learned cooking and bookkeeping. They had auditoriums where students gave speeches and watched films. Gary's Emerson School, built in 1909 and designed by the St. Louis architect William Ittner, was the first high school in Indiana with an indoor swimming pool. Educators from across the country and eventually the world came to see what Wirt was doing. By 1929, more than 200 cities had adopted some version of his platoon system in over 1,000 schools. New York City hired Wirt as a consultant in 1914 at $10,000 a year. The Gary Plan became a national movement, debated in the pages of every major newspaper, praised by the Federal Bureau of Education, and attacked by labor unions who thought it was training factory workers rather than educating citizens. For a raw industrial town not yet a decade old, this was an astonishing cultural achievement. Gary was simultaneously the most modern mill in the world and the most innovative school district in the country. The growth attracted everyone, and not everyone came in peace. The steel strike of 1919 was the first time most Americans heard the name Gary, Indiana. On September 22nd, workers across the country walked off the job, 350,000 in all, from Chicago to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, demanding union recognition, shorter hours, and higher wages. In Gary, the strikebreakers came from outside, and on October 4th, a riot broke out on Broadway. Strikers and scabs fought in the street. Indiana Governor James P. Goodrich declared martial law 3 days later. Then 4,000 federal troops arrived under Major General Leonard Wood, the same Leonard Wood who had commanded the Rough Riders with Theodore Roosevelt. Soldiers with bayonets patrolled Broadway. It was the first of several times that Gary would make national headlines for violence rather than industry. U.S. Steel broke the strike. The workers went back to the furnaces, and the company learned something important. It could win. The Ku Klux Klan organized in Indiana in 1915 and grew to terrifying proportions through the early 1920s. At its peak, the Indiana chapter was the largest in the nation, with 2,000 new members signing up every week. In Gary, where immigrants and black workers made up the majority of the laboring population, the Klan found fertile ground among native-born whites who felt their city being reshaped around them. This current of racial hostility ran beneath everything that Gary built in those years, a fault line that would, decades later, split the city apart. But in the meantime, Gary was building, and building big. By the 1920s, Broadway was becoming the commercial heart of a region. Picture it, a wide boulevard lined with brick and stone buildings, each one taller and more ornate than the last, climbing skyward as if the city couldn't believe its own ambition. In 1924, the architect George W. Marr, a prairie school designer who had studied with Frank Lloyd Wright's mentor, drew up the Gateway Improvement Plan for the northern end of Broadway where it met the mill entrance. The plan called for a grand civic center, a city hall, a courthouse, a park. Marr committed suicide in 1926 before the work was done, and his son Philip took over, trading his father's prairie sensibility for a neoclassical grandeur, columns, domes, and gold leaf. City Hall was finished in 1928, a 4-story building with a Doric colonnade and a gold dome that gleamed when the sun hit it. Across Broadway, the Lake County Superior Courthouse went up a year later, designed by J.T. Hutton and Sons, with its own gold dome and its own set of columns. as if the two buildings were in conversation. A bronze statue of Judge Elbert Gary, sculpted by Bryant Baker, was erected between them in 1927, the year the judge himself died, having never lived in the city that bore his name. He had overseen the creation of U.S. Steel with J.P. Morgan in 1901, had chosen the site, had approved the expenditures. But Gary, Indiana, was an abstraction to him, a line item on a balance sheet, a monument to his own name that he could admire from the distance of a boardroom in New York. Down on the lakefront, the city was building something more intimate. Marquette Park, named for the French Jesuit missionary Jacques Marquette, who had camped at the site in 1675 while sick and traveling back to Michigan, had been landscaped in the 1920s with the kind of investment that cities make when they believe in their own future. The Gary Bathing Beach Aquatorium opened on June 18, 1922, designed by George W. Marr in the Prairie style, a graceful, low-slung building of brick and stone where bathers could change and shower before stepping onto the sand of Lake Michigan. On summer weekends, the beach was packed. Families spread blankets within sight of the smokestacks. Children swam in water that, on a clear day, showed no sign of the industry that paid for everything. The aquatorium remained in use until 1971, 50 years of summers, and then silence. Just south of the lakefront, Broadway erupted into commerce. The department stores came: Goldblatt's, H.C. Gordon and Sons, Litton's, Hudson's Ladies Store, J.C., Penny, the Fair Department Store, Radigan Brothers Furniture. On a Saturday afternoon in the late 1920s, you could walk Broadway from 4th Avenue to 9th and pass more commerce per block than most Indiana cities had in their entire downtown. The Kresge Five and Dime was there. The Gary National Bank building anchored the corner of 5th and Broadway, the very spot where the Knotts brothers had driven that first stake 20 years before. The Knights of Columbus Hotel fronted 5th Avenue. West of Broadway, the residential streets bore the names of presidents: Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, each one lined with brick houses and masonry apartment buildings. The executives' homes on Tyler Street and Lincoln Street had large lots and architectural pretensions: prairie-style houses, Art Deco facades, the kind of craftsmanship that builders invest in only when they believe a neighborhood will appreciate for decades. At 413 Tyler Street and 636 Lincoln Street, mansions rose that would have looked at home in any Chicago suburb. The contrast was jarring. A few blocks east, the row houses built by the company for mill workers, poured concrete, identical, functional, known simply as mill houses, stood in tight ranks like soldiers at attention. But even the mill workers lived in solid structures on paved streets. And on Saturday night, their money was as good as anyone's on Broadway. At the corner of 7th Avenue and Van Buren Street, the architect Frank Lloyd Wright designed a house for a man named Ingwald Moe, one of Wright's characteristic prairie homes, all horizontal lines and overhanging eaves, tucked into a Gary neighborhood as casually as if it were Oak Park. Wright's presence in Gary was not an accident. This was a city that attracted serious architects, because serious money was being spent. Shoppers came from across the region. Broadway was not just Gary's main street. It was the commercial capital of Northwest Indiana. The buildings that went up in those years were not modest. The Hotel Gary, designed by Charles Wheeler Nickel and completed in 1926, rose 10 stories on Broadway, promising guests, with a slogan that tells you everything about the city's self-image: a night's sleep away from the dirt and grime of Chicago. The original plans called for a middle tower that was never built, but even without it, the Hotel Gary was the tallest building for miles. Performers appearing at the Memorial Auditorium nearby would stay there, and over the years, those performers included names that would later seem impossible for a city of this size: Mahalia Jackson, B.B. King, Sammy Davis Jr., Bob Hope, Ray Charles, Marian Anderson. Harry Truman gave a campaign speech there. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke there. Frank Borman, the astronaut, visited. The hotel closed in 1971 and was converted to senior housing, renamed Genesis Towers. It still stands on Broadway. The Memorial Auditorium itself was a statement of civic confidence that bordered on audacity. Commissioned by the Gary Land Company to honor Gary residents killed in the First World War, It was designed by local architect Joseph Henry Wildermuth and completed in 1927 at a cost of $5 million. $5 million for an auditorium in a town that was 21 years old. It seated 5,000. Its stage was the largest in the region. Its asbestos fire curtain was the largest of its kind in the country. The floor seats were removable so the space could transform from concert hall to basketball arena to art exhibition to boxing ring. The Golden Gloves boxing tournaments ran there from 1939 to 1959. A citywide talent contest held there in the early 1960s was won by a group of brothers from Jackson Street. 5 kids with a sound so tight and a lead singer so electrifying that they would eventually leave Gary, move to California, and change American popular music forever. The Jackson 5 played their first major hometown gig in the building that U.S. Steel had built to honor the war dead. Down the street, the Palace Theater opened in November 1925 at 791 Broadway. Designed by John Eberson, the Dean of American Theater Architects, and built by the construction firm of Max & Sons, it was an atmospheric theater, meaning the interior was designed to feel like an outdoor courtyard. The ceiling was painted to look like a night sky. The walls were fashioned to resemble a Spanish castle, complete with Greek and Roman statues and imported chandeliers. It seated 2,500. For 35 years, the Palace was the most popular theater in Gary, carrying audiences from the silent era through the talkies, through the golden age of Hollywood, through the arrival of Clark Gable and Humphrey Bogart on its screen. The Palace wasn't alone. The Broadway Theater, the Tivoli, and others lined the street, each one pulling Gary's working families into darkened rooms where, for a few hours, the mill and the furnace and the 12-hour shift disappeared. And then there was City Methodist Church. In October 1926, the Reverend William Grant Seaman, known around town as Sonny Jim, opened the doors of a 9-story Gothic revival complex at 6th Avenue and Washington Street. Seaman had arrived at Gary's original Methodist congregation in 1916 and immediately decided the church needed to be larger, grander, and more ambitious than anything the city had seen. Gary in the 1910s was thick with saloons and brothels, and Seaman believed that a magnificent church, open 7 days a week, could pull the city toward something better. He lobbied U.S. Steel, and the corporation donated both the land and nearly half the construction cost. The church was designed by the Chicago firm of Lowe and Bolenbacher and took 21 months to build, at a total cost of $800,000. The sanctuary seated 950. The adjacent Seaman Hall could hold 1,000 more and contained a fellowship hall paneled in oak, corporate offices, Sunday school rooms, a large kitchen, a dining room, a commercial cafeteria, retail stores, and, on the 3rd floor, a full gymnasium. Seaman envisioned a rooftop garden and tennis court. The organ was donated by Judge Elbert Gary himself. Seaman saw his church as a bridge between Gary's fractured communities. He organized interfaith pageants. He opposed the screening of the birth of a nation. He tried to convince Methodist Hospital to admit black patients. He held a race relations service in 1927 where members of black congregations visited to share worship. This was audacious for Gary in the 1920s. Indiana's Ku Klux Klan chapter was, at that time, the largest in the nation, with 2,000 new members joining every week. Seaman's push for diversity made him deeply unpopular with his own congregation. By 1929, just 3 years after the church opened, his parishioners had him involuntarily transferred to Ohio. He died in 1944. In accordance with his wishes, his ashes were returned to Gary and interred inside the church. By 1930, Gary's population had crossed 100,000, a milestone it had reached in just 24 years. The city was the 5th largest in Indiana, comparable to South Bend and Fort Wayne. The 1930 census counted the population at 100,426. Nearly 20% were foreign-born. Another quarter had at least one foreign-born parent. The black population stood at close to 18%, a proportion that would grow dramatically in the decades to come. Gary had 3 daily newspapers. It had a federal courthouse on Broadway. It had a public library system, a bathing pavilion on Lake Michigan designed by the Prairie School architect George W. Marr, and a lakefront park with preserved sand dunes that the Gary Tribune had called mementos of the time when the entire region consisted of dunes. The city even had 96 concrete houses designed by Thomas Edison, poured from a single mold as part of Edison's experiment in affordable housing, built between 1910 and 1914 as the city was expanding at a pace that amazed even its founders. Broadway by now was not just a street, it was a catalog of American ambition compressed into a dozen blocks. If you stood at 5th and Broadway on a Saturday evening in, say, 1937, and turned slowly in a circle, you would see the Gary National Bank building, the Hotel Gary rising 10 stories to the north, the glow of theater marquees to the south, the dome of City Hall catching the last orange light of a Lake Michigan sunset, and everywhere, people. Steel workers in clean shirts, their wives in department store dresses, their children with movie money in their pockets, the smell of the lake mixing with the smell of the mills, streetcars clattering through the intersection, and behind it all, to the north, the perpetual red glow of the blast furnaces, visible from anywhere in town, a reminder that all of this, every building, every paycheck, every Saturday night, existed because of what was happening in those furnaces. A city built on liquid steel. Consider the scale of the mill itself by the late 1920s. Gary Works contained 12 blast furnaces, 838 coke ovens, 45 open hearth furnaces, a rail mill, a billet mill, a slabbing mill, 2 plate mills, 12 merchant mills, an axle mill, a steel wheel plant, and a dozen mechanical shops covering 300,000 square feet. The buildings alone contained over 100,000 tons of structural steel and 163 million bricks. The mill produced raw steel, rails, wire, tin plate, rods, pipes, tubes, sheets, wheels, axles, and cement. It was, in the words of one contemporary observer, one of the industrial wonders of the 20th century, and it ran around the clock, 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, the furnaces never cooling, the glow never dimming. The city grew through the Depression. The population actually rose to 111,719 by 1940, a testament to the fact that even in hard times, steel kept people working when other industries couldn't. The big department stores on Broadway held on. The Palace Theater kept showing pictures. City Methodist Church's congregation was growing, leasing floors of Seaman Hall to Gary College and later to Indiana University to bring in revenue, but filling its pews every Sunday. The WPA built a post office on Broadway, designed by Howard Lovewell Cheney, the architect who would later design Washington National Airport, a federal building for a company town, as if the government itself were acknowledging that Gary had arrived. Then came the war, and everything accelerated. Gary Works ran at absolute full capacity, producing steel for Sherman tanks, Liberty ships, ammunition casings, and the 1,000 other implements of the arsenal of democracy. Workers poured in from the rural South, black families by the thousands, following the same path that earlier waves of European immigrants had traveled, drawn by the same promise, steady work at good wages. The population hit 133,911 by 1950. City Methodist Church reached the pinnacle of its influence with more than 3,000 members. The Golden Gloves boxing tournaments packed the Memorial Auditorium every year from 1939 to 1959, and the roar of the crowd when a local boy landed a clean right hand could be heard from the sidewalk. On Broadway, you could eat at a dozen restaurants, shop at department stores that rivaled anything in Chicago, and catch a double feature at the Palace before walking home past brick houses with trimmed lawns and porch lights on. This was the American industrial city at its fullest expression, prosperous, confident, and completely dependent on a single industry. And the city kept climbing to 178,320 in 1960, the peak. Gary was now the 70th largest city in the United States. Its tax base was anchored by the largest steel mill in the Western Hemisphere. Its schools, though no longer the progressive showpiece Wirt had built, still graduated thousands. Its Broadway was still the region's main street. To anyone standing at 5th and Broadway in 1960, the future must have looked like more of the same. Bigger, richer, forever. But cracks had been forming for years, hairline fractures that most people didn't notice because the paychecks were still good and the furnaces were still glowing. The first crack was structural. By 1959, the United States had become a net importer of steel. New mills in Japan and West Germany, rebuilt after the war with newer technology, were producing steel more cheaply than the aging open hearth furnaces of the Calumet region. The math was starting to turn. A second crack was geographic. The interstate highway system, which Congress authorized in 1956, made it easy to live far from the city where you worked. Gary's middle-class families began looking south toward open land and newer houses. A third crack was demographic, and it ran deeper than the others. Gary had been rigidly segregated since its founding. The black population, which had surged during the Great Migration, was confined largely to a single neighborhood south of downtown called Midtown. By 1950, 97% of Gary's black residents lived in this one area. As the black population grew and began pushing for open housing, white residents accelerated their departure. The tensions surfaced in the schools before they surfaced anywhere else. In 1945, hundreds of white students walked out of the newly integrated Froebel School. Frank Sinatra, 29 years old, the biggest singer in America, came to Gary and performed at the Memorial Auditorium, singing "The House I Live In" and speaking about equality and acceptance. It was a remarkable moment. The most famous entertainer in the country, standing in a 5,000-seat auditorium in a steel town, telling steelworkers' children that the kid in the next desk deserved the same shot they had. The Gary School Board adopted a desegregation policy in 1946, but white students at Emerson School staged another walkout anyway. It took until 1949 for Indiana state law to formally desegregate public schools. In 1967, Gary elected Richard Gordon Hatcher as its mayor, one of the first black mayors of a major American city. Hatcher was a formidable man, a civil rights attorney who had pushed for an open housing ordinance. His election was historic. It was also the moment that much of white Gary decided to leave. During Hatcher's first term, he used the phrase, "city on the move." His critics had a ready reply, "Yes, everyone's moving out." The turning point, if you had to pick one, came not with a crash, but with a ribbon cutting. In 1955, the Village Shopping Center had opened on Gary's south side, anchored by J.C., Penny, Kresge's, and Kroger, with 500 new single-family homes built nearby to anchor the development. It was Gary's attempt to keep retail dollars inside the city limits. For about 15 years, it worked. The village replaced downtown Broadway as the region's main shopping destination. But then, in 1971, the town of Merrillville incorporated just south of Gary, exploiting a legal maneuver that bypassed Indiana's buffer zone law, which had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of suburban encroachment. Merrillville had land, it had low taxes, and it had no attachment to Gary's problems. Sears and Roebuck relocated there. Public protests and boycott threats changed nothing. Goldblatt's closed. Hudson's closed. One by one, the Broadway anchors went dark or followed their customers south. The numbers tell the rest. Gary Works employed over 30,000 people in the early 1970s. By 1990, it employed 6,000. By 2015, 5,100. By 2023, 2,200. Each layoff sent families to other cities and other states. The population fell from 175,415 in 1970 to 151,968 in 1980, to 116,646 in 1990, to 102,746 in 2000, to 80,294 in 2010, to 69,093 in 2020. Each decade, another 20 or 30,000 people simply left. By 2013, the Gary Department of Redevelopment estimated that 1/3 of all homes in the city were unoccupied or abandoned. The Palace Theater closed in 1972. The Memorial Auditorium closed that same year. The Hotel Gary closed in 1971 and became a senior housing tower. City Methodist Church held its last service on January 3, 1975, with just 300 members remaining in a building designed for thousands. Goldblatt's department store closed in 1973. Radigan Brothers Furniture, whose owner Joseph Radigan had run against Richard Hatcher for mayor in 1967, closed in 1975 and moved to Merrillville. The city built a Genesis Convention Center in 1981 and a Holiday Inn hotel, hoping to reverse the tide. Neither worked. The convention center is now abandoned. On the night of October 12, 1997, a fire broke out in the abandoned Goldblatt's building on Broadway. Winds of 31 miles per hour drove the flames north and east. The fire jumped to Radigan Brothers. It reached the Memorial Auditorium. Embers carried to the roof of Genesis Towers, where elderly residents had to be evacuated into the streets. Sparks landed on City Methodist Church. By dawn, 8 buildings on Broadway had been severely damaged or destroyed. More than 200 firefighters from Gary and surrounding communities fought the blaze. Only a quarter of the Memorial Auditorium survived. The fire marshal called the blaze suspicious, but never used the word arson. There was no official investigation. The remains of Goldblatt's were dynamited and cleared by the summer of 1999. Sand from a decommissioned railroad embankment was trucked downtown to fill the holes. City Methodist Church still stands, though stands is generous. The roof has partially collapsed. Trees grow from the third-floor gymnasium where the ceiling caved in. The stained glass is gone, stolen, or shattered. Ivy cascades through the empty window frames. The ashes of William Seaman remain interred somewhere inside. Hollywood has used the ruins as a set. Transformers, Dark of the Moon, A Nightmare on Elm Street, the Netflix series Sense8. Tourists come to photograph the decay. The city charges $50 for an exploration permit. Broadway runs north and south through Gary the way it always has. The bronze statue of Judge Elbert Gary still stands at the north end, between the courthouse and City Hall. The courthouse still operates. City Hall still functions. But south of the Civic Gateway, Broadway is a sequence of absences. Vacant lots where Goldblatt stood, boarded storefronts where the crowds once pressed against display windows on Saturday afternoons, the shell of the Palace Theater with its plywood-covered windows. In 2002, when Gary hosted the Miss USA pageant, Donald Trump had workers paint false interiors onto the plywood boards covering the palace's ticket windows. A painted ticket agent, a painted lobby, so that Broadway would look presentable on television. At 2300 Jackson Street, about a mile and a half south of downtown, a 672-square-foot bungalow sits behind an iron fence. Built in 1949 during the post-war boom, it has 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen, and a living room. Joe Jackson, a crane operator at Inland Steel in nearby East Chicago, moved there with his wife Catherine in 1950, and they raised 9 children in those rooms, 3 bedrooms worth of kids, if the house had had 3 bedrooms, which it didn't. Their 5th son, Michael, was born in 1958. Throughout the 1960s, while the city around them was beginning its long slide, the Jackson brothers were rehearsing in that living room, playing local talent shows, working the circuit of clubs that stretched from Gary through Chicago. They won a citywide talent contest at the Memorial Auditorium. They left for California in 1971, the same year the Hotel Gary closed and Merrillville incorporated, the family and the city on inverse trajectories, one rising as the other fell. The house is now the most visited site in Gary. An 8-foot granite memorial stone stands in the front yard. Highway signs on Interstate 80/94 direct tourists to the home of the world-famous Jackson 5. The neighborhood around it is quiet. Some of the neighboring houses are occupied, others are not. The street, incidentally, was always called Jackson Street. The family didn't choose it for the name, but the coincidence has become inseparable from the legend. 2300 Jackson Street, Gary, Indiana, a title so musical that the family used it as the name of their 1989 album. The Gary Works still operates at the north end of Broadway, still the largest integrated steel mill in North America, still producing flat-rolled steel for automobiles and appliances, though it now employs fewer people than the Memorial Auditorium once seated. In 2018, U.S. Steel announced a $750 million modernization investment. The blast furnaces still glow at night, still visible from the old residential streets to the south. But the streets themselves are quieter now. A third of the houses are dark. The theaters are closed. The department stores are gone. The hotel is a senior tower. The church is a ruin with trees growing where the congregation sat. In 1957, Meredith Willson put the name of the city into the mouth of a fictional con man in The Music Man. Professor Harold Hill, who claims to hail from Gary, Indiana, claims to have attended the Gary Conservatory of Music, class of '05. It's a lie, of course. Everything about Harold Hill is a lie. And the audience laughs, because in 1957, everyone knew Gary. It was a real place, a prosperous place, a place a man might plausibly be proud to come from. The joke only works if Gary means something. Broadway runs north, through the empty blocks, past the painted plywood and the vacant lots, past the spot where Armanus Knotts drove the first stake into the sand in 1906, straight to the mill gate. The furnaces burn. The street is still.